Namaste everyone, welcome to our 10th episode of Stars, Stripes, and Sanatanis. I'm your host for today, Richa Jani, and I'm a high school junior from Texas.
Hello, I am your habitual host, Bhuvanesh.
Hey guys, I am Hrantika Burra and I will be debuting as a host for Stars, Stripes, and Sanatas today. I have done lots of research about Hindus being persecuted in Islamic countries, so I'm excited to share some of what I know.
Hi everyone, I'm Shriprada, and I don't want to introduce myself alliteratively, but you might recognize me from the Mahashivratri Reflection podcast.
Real talk though, we will be discussing some very heavy topics today, so we will probably be a little light on humor.
Yeah, I know that we're known for humor and corny jokes, but I think today will be more serious and an informative episode.
Yes, this is necessary. We do not want to make light of any trauma as we discuss the persecution of Hindus throughout history by many aggressors.
We will emphasize constructive dialogue and inclusive narratives in today's debate. As Hindus, we bear the responsibilities of having to both speak about and defend our rights to talk about these cases.
Absolutely. Colonized narratives and selective biases have really silenced the Hindu voice. By talking about this, we hope to educate our listeners about the tragedies faced by Hindus, historically and in modern times.
Yeah, so let's get to it. In a previous episode, we mentioned that waves of Islamic invasions of India occurred around 7 to 8 centuries ago. The first major instances of persecution of Hindus occurred then.
The purpose of mentioning this is not to hate on Muslims, but instead to shed light on the persecution of Hindus due to their status as non-believers.
So many Islamic rulers took over India over the centuries, and temples were continually destroyed. Though there were periods of peace, there were also periods of massacre and conflict that should not be whitewashed.
First, it's important to define what persecution is. To many, persecution is limited to killing and to acts of war and violence, but persecution is any act which serves to lower the quality of life of a specific group of people on a basis of a common characteristic.
Throughout all of the Islamic occupation, Hindus were referred to as dhimmi. Literally, this meant they were seen as non-believers. Because of this, we had to pay a tax called jizya, which is a form of financial persecution.
Comments made by the Delhi sultans adversely dehumanized Hindus, and the sultans supposedly had the job of humiliating Hindu subjects. During the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th through 16th centuries, Hindus were seen as slaves, and in general, the practice of Hinduism was attacked. Well-known Hindu schools of learning were also destroyed.
Continuing on with the Madurai Sultanate, Allah al-Din Khilji persecuted Hindus in the Madurai region, followed by Mubarak Shah. After a power struggle that displaced many Hindus, this short-lived sultanate was born. Much of the literature discovered from this time period mentions that the goal of conquering Madurai and many other Tamar areas was to destroy the infidels and regulate the spread of Hinduism.
It is truly disgusting how many temples were looted and destroyed even before the Mughal Empire came into power. Some people say that the selective permission granted by rulers to Hindus to rebuild temples constitutes tolerance. However, standards of basic human decency dictate that this is not the case. The atrocities, whether interspersed with periods of peacetime or not, are wrong and must be discussed.
The Mughal Empire, for the most part, was demonizing Hindus. Any assertion to the contrary are ill-informed. A couple of rulers with some form of elementary fascination of Hindu customs and traditions does not give people a license to conveniently pretend that history does not exist.
Hold on, rant time though. Can we stop using tolerant as the bar for rulers of a kingdom, especially with respect to religion or philosophy? Because people should be embraced for having diversity of thought.
For sure. And whatever tolerance they had was clearly superficial. Aurangzeb destroyed more temples than any other Islamic ruler, and the brief Hindu pushback is seen as a way to demonize Hindus and delegitimize their struggles from this generation. Hindus were beaten. They were tortured because they followed Dharma instead of Islam. Speaking from a humanitarian perspective, all torture and killing is awful. This is really sad.
Next, we must discuss Tipu Sultan. He reigned as the king of Mysore for 17 years. By many accounts, his rule was good. He warned against the influences of Western society and colonization, turned Mysore into a global economic force, and grew the kingdom's silk industry.
However, his own expansionist and colonialist mindset, coupled with a difference in religious viewpoints, led him to massacre many Hindus during his rule.
The reality is brutal. In his conquest, he destroyed many Hindu temples, caused many Hindus to become casualties of war, and converted a large number of surviving Hindus to Islam.
Yeah, and the thing is, this was right before the British rule. When the British came in to try and take India for itself, they wanted Tipu out. They vilified him, painting him as a tyrant and an oppressor. Though colonizers are known to spin their tales, unfortunately, the Hindu persecution cannot be denied. Seriously, this shouldn't be a divisive thing to say. It's just true. As long as you don't use this as an excuse for present day violence.
Exactly, Bhuvanish. I totally agree. It's super infuriating. I don't want to go into much of the specifics of what Tipu Sultan did, but there were several graphic and physically gruesome atrocities committed for those that did not comply with the request to convert. Many others agree as well, as can be seen by the violent clashes that occurred in 2015 when Tipu Jayanti was celebrated in Karnataka.
The people of Kerala and Mangalore were gaslit into thinking that Tipu Sultan was merely a product of his time, or that he was simply like all Mughal rulers. These are manipulative remarks, and I cannot believe that we have to say that any religious persecution is bad, no matter the circumstance. If you're a Hindu listening to this podcast and still don't think that Hinduphobia has been a problem, you need to wake up and recognize the people who've suffered so that you can practice your culture safely. Don't do performative Insta activism and then shut your mouth when these atrocities are pointed out.
The next historical example of Hindu persecution occurred under European colonization. Specifically, it was carried out by the Portuguese.
One brutal yet little-known instance was the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa. It ran from 1560 to the mid-1700s. The Portuguese Catholic colonizers sought out to convert Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus to Catholicism. Those who were caught performing their quote-unquote heathen rituals were punished by brutal tortures in the House of Inquisition. In fact, many Goan Christians who held on to their cultural customs were tortured even after conversion because they apparently weren't pure enough or white enough to be allowed to live. Many mandirs and other dharmic sites were destroyed, and the Konkani language was suppressed and forcibly replaced with Portuguese.
Like many colonial events, a lot of the evidence has been lost for the persecution that took place. But there are a few notable pieces of evidence. In fact, one Frenchman who was jailed in Goa documented the horrors of the Inquisition and wrote a book about it. To this day, the Vatican has not apologized to Goans for the trauma that has been inflicted on their community.
The Portuguese weren't the only colonizers who were Hinduphobic. The British sought to convert the so-called idol-worshipping heathens to Christianity. Many neo-colonial conversion tactics are still in use today. Many forms of traditional dances were banned and censored through laws, such as the Anti-Nach Act in Tamil Nadu. Though social divisions did exist prior to the British, what's referred to as the modern-day caste system was engineered by the British officials, who passed numerous laws that economically devastated and disenfranchised large parts of the populace, pushing more and more people into poverty. Ironically, textbooks and scholars nowadays completely skip over these facts, claiming instead that Hindu Dharma itself operates on rigid systems of oppression and genocide, using that as a reason to claim that large-scale Hinduphobia does not exist.
The British also uprooted traditional dharmic education, which catered a variety of different jatis, and replaced it with an education system that sought to whiten Indians and favored people who they deemed as high caste. This was known as Macaulayism, a system of colonial indoctrination created by Thomas Macaulay. Macaulay was a blatant white supremacist who believed that the English language was far superior to anything in Sanskritam or Arabic. Clearly, he hadn't read the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita or Vedanta or any Hindu scientific works.
Also, the legacy of partition has devastated multiple religious communities in India. One of its effects on Hindus is the persecution they face in Pakistan. Hindus, being a slim minority in the Islam majority nation, make up 2.14% of the country's population, a sharp decline for a number that was well over 10% originally.
And, referencing our past episode on Kashmiri Hindu heritage, there have been a total of 7 exoduses of Kashmiri Hindus from their homeland in the past 700 years. Some of these exoduses occurred as a result of political and religious tensions in the Kashmir area after partition.
First, in order to acknowledge the Bangladeshi situation, we must go back a few decades. The partition of Pakistan and Bangladesh, which was formerly known as East Pakistan, occurred in 1971. Bangladesh gained independence after a 9-month guerrilla war against the Pakistani military, which culminated in the deaths of around 3 million civilians in the Bangladesh War of Independence and Bangladesh genocide.
The Pakistani military launched a 10-month genocide drive against the ethnic Bengali and Hindu religious minorities in present-day Bangladesh on March 25, 1971.
Hinduism comprises hardly around 9% of the densely populated country of Bangladesh. However, even though Hinduism is the largest minority in the Islamic country, the Hindu populations have been shrinking due to the hateful persecutions going on.
Many claim that the Hindu population only declined before partition, but even after the partition, the population percentage continues to decline.
Hello, everyone. Now we're transitioning into the period of our episode where we have an interview with someone who has authentically faced a lot of the reverberations of this persecution. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Priyanti. I'm a sophomore. I go to school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
We're really happy to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast. And let us get started with our first question here, which is, how do we increase awareness of persecution against Hindus, in your opinion?
In my opinion, there are several ways to sort of bring awareness or activists to persecution of Hindus. The most commonly is obviously through social media, just like reposting posts, sharing posts, educating yourself through social platforms. But I think that in all, like, doing your own education and research is like the most effective way of just really like understanding the situation in itself.
I do agree with your point about doing independent research and conducting independent research. In terms of what people can constructively do, are you saying that people should continue to create these infographics, continue to create these sort of digestible sources of information that convey the plight of Hindu persecution? Or perhaps are there other things that we can do?
100%. I think that infographics are very important. I think we should be using them. And I think also that there are other ways to go about this. For example, like, signing petitions, hosting like interviews like this with people who are like facing this discrimination in those areas where the Hindus are being persecuted. So there are many different ways that you can spread awareness, but yeah.
Absolutely. I do agree a lot about what you said with respect to becoming a little bit more civically engaged and taking action with respect to calling and signing petitions. I have a friend of mine who really spends all day filing grievances to the government of Andhra Pradesh in order to increase historical awareness of the destruction of temples there and sort of create a preservation initiative there. So I think that with respect to persecution, you can make the government have sort of awareness of that if you make petitions and file grievances. And I think that can sort of hold these people accountable for not recognizing certain persecutions or biases or genocides, especially those towards the Hindu people. Moving on to our second question, do you think that enough people know about or discuss the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide?
Absolutely not. I've actually encountered Bangladeshi Hindus themselves who like don't even know what's happening, that like live here in the U.S. And other places in the world. In fact, like the persecution, like that's still going on to this day, not many people know about. Just recently, like an attack that happened actually close to my village in Sylhet, Bangladesh, where over like 100 villages were vandalized of Hindu people, just hit Western media after a long time, where people are going out and protesting and doing all sorts of activism. But again, not many people like know about this issue, which is why I think it's so important to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Your point about awareness to Hindus themselves with respect to what's happening and how, like, what's going on, I think that's super important as well. Um, and especially the lag of the Western media of covering instances of Hindu persecution, contemporary instances, is absolutely mind-boggling. And I'd say it's like ethically dishonest. And
Yeah.
you should bring a lot of these global issues equally. But of course, that seldom happens. So, along those lines of Hindu recognition of Hindu persecution, to whom should awareness efforts be aimed at, in your opinion?
Ideally, we want everyone to know about these issues, and we want like everyone to sort of have an understanding of what's going on. But I think most importantly, our youth. It's really important for our youth to understand what's happening. Just because we are the future and we really can change what's happening around the world, and especially this situation. And through education, through our youth, we can contact, bigger people in power, who can, input and imply those changes and make things happen. So, like, just like talking to people around you, talking to anyone that wants to be educated is just also really important.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you've tried that. So that segues perfectly into my next question. What are your experiences talking about Hindu persecution to other people?
I've actually gotten like a lot of responses. I've had a lot of people who've actually have been educated about this before, but haven't had like much education about it. I've had people that have like no education, have no idea, didn't even know that like Hinduism was a religion to begin with, and I've just had like a variety of responses. But I think for the most part, I've seen that a lot of people just like didn't understand that this was happening, didn't know at all like what I was talking about. So yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty wide spectrum there, but I guess there are a wide spectrum of people, right?
Right.
And people with degrees of knowledge with regards to Hindu persecution. So, to sort of level out that knowledge field, as we were talking before, what are some ways we can fix a lack of historical understanding beyond sort of social media campaigns? So, one way we did mention was sort of appealing directly to politicians and to governments. But do you think there are other ways of doing that?
Yeah, I for sure think there are ways to, if you want to take a big step, there are ways to, even start your own campaign, start your own project where even like creating fundraisers and things like that can really help those people who are right now being oppressed. And I think just, again, like education is the most important thing, and having that solid foundation. And then through that, you're able to make all those big changes. So big activism, big on social media, big on just doing as much as you can from what you have, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really reassuring to hear from you, because I think that a lot of people are sort of beginning to be fatigued by these sort of initiatives. But I think that fatigue that people are feeling, like the people on the receiving end of the activism, does not compare to those who are actually going through
Right.
the persecution at hand. And I think that sort of perspective needs to be addressed. And I think it has. I've also seen a lot of infographics addressing that particular issue, where people are like, "Oh no, I'm getting tired of seeing all of this negativity," and then people are just like, "Oh yeah, but imagine feeling it." So our last question, and if you don't feel comfortable divulging this, that's fine. But what are your experiences as a Bangladeshi Hindu with respect to persecution?
Yeah, so we all know that like Bangladesh is a majority Islamic country, And so, for the most part, when I go to Bangladesh, I see a lot of Hindu women having to adapt to some of these Islamic traditions and cultures. For example, my mom, when she goes to Bangladesh, she usually wipes the sindoor off her forehead, which is significant in Hinduism, just so people don't know that she's a Hindu. A lot of women have also had to cover up, had to not show their bangles, which indicate they're married in Hinduism, and just do small acts like that, just to make sure they're not targeted. A lot of the men in my family in Bangladesh had to grow their beards out really long when they didn't want to, because so they weren't again targeted as a Hindu person. So those are just small things that I've noticed in Bangladesh that have made people feel unsafe, that have had to hide their identity just to protect themselves. And it's hard seeing it on little kids, because they're usually doing all these things and they don't know what it means, and it's just really hard to explain. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you think that people in the American diaspora of Hinduism, right? If you think those people potentially are disconnected from Hindu ideals, I cannot imagine what those who are directly oppressed for being Hindu have to go through, and how much of their Hindu ideals they're able to retain. But from what you're describing to me, it seems as if your relatives are doing a pretty decent job keeping themselves, centered with respect to Hinduism, and that's really admirable with given their situation. Um, so, thank you for joining us today. It was a really great pleasure of mine to hear you divulge your experiences and your thoughts, and we will see you later.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Stars, Stripes, and Sanatanis, and keep up with us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen. We're trying our best to make this channel a place where Hindu youth can learn about important issues, and we greatly appreciate our community's support.
Follow at HSD High School on Instagram, and also ask yourself some questions with respect to how you view the persecution of Hindus.
Number 1. How many instances of Hindu persecution can you actually recall, and have you stood up for these communities in discussions where their plights are belittled? Number 2. Do Hindus themselves have any internal biases telling you that the persecution is not relevant, that Hinduphobia supposedly isn't a big problem, that we are silencing the voice of others for advocating against atrocities that happen to us, or any other rhetoric along those lines? Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next week.